what I found really interesting when starting up Verum was, and it kind of leads on to the community side of things, was the sheer number of people who in a corporate world were focusing on kind of private blockchain applications, but in their personal lives were getting into fully public permissionless ways of interacting, ways of kind of creating content, selling it, all that kind of stuff. Like there was such a difference between their work lives and their private lives. And I think that's going to merge more and more and more.
Welcome to the SSI Orbit podcast, a forum for conversations that explore the ever-growing ecosystems of self-sovereign identity. And I'm your host, Mathieu Glaude. Today I sit down with Fraser Edwards, CEO of Verum, a company building an SSI digital credentials network on Cosmos to create commercial viability via tokenized incentives. And prior to Verum, Fraser has worked across multiple technologies and industries internationally, specializing in decentralized identity, blockchain-based payments, and fintech. Now, during this conversation, we discuss how Fraser got into digital identity through the Known Traveler Digital Identity Project. We talk about how SSI will become more commercially viable in various business use cases using tokenomics. We talk about the parallels of self-sovereign identity to blockchain deployments and the learnings that Fraser got from multiple blockchain deployments that could be applied towards the commercialization of self-sovereign identity projects. We talk about why Verum chose Cosmos and how they're working within the Cosmos ecosystem. We also talk about why SSI adoption through crypto and DeFi is so exciting, and much more. Now, thank you for listening in today. I'm really glad to have you here. And now, without any further ado, here's my conversation with Fraser Edwards from Verum. Enjoy. Over the past, 15 months, and it's probably been longer than that, but over the past 15 months, there's been a lot of focus on these travel passes, and it kind of morphed into COVID passes when COVID came and the whole COVID thing accelerated these things. So there's been tons of projects and tons of people from various communities kind of coming together to build these health passes or travel passes or however we want to call it. When I was looking into your background kind of before getting into Verum, which we'll get to throughout this conversation, I saw that you had some background in kind of the travel pass space, having worked on some projects there. And I think it was kind of before the whole COVID stuff started. Would you be able to give a bit of a background on the Known Travel Pass or the Known Traveler Digital Identity project that you worked on? And how it kind of got you moving towards the whole digital identity space?
Yeah, sure. So the Known Traveler Digital Identity Project started ultimately from the World Economic Forum about 3 or 4 years ago. They authored a paper called the KTDI, the Known Traveler Digital Identity. And really it was at the time looking at kind of massively growing passenger volumes and how you would try and facilitate those volumes in airports where most of them have been built kind of decades ago and were never envisaged to kind of have this many passengers flowing through. And the main touch points or the main kind of bottlenecks that were identified were the touch points that involve identity. So whether that is identity expressed through a passport, whether that is a boarding pass, or really anything else, those were really the bottlenecks that were identified. Like those touch points where pieces of paper are being checked by staff members, or even if you're checking in online, just kind of those bottlenecks that stop people progressing through the airport so quickly. So the KTDI kind of envisaged a digital identity, which could then be used to pass through those touch points extremely quickly. So working quite similar to the IATA One ID concept, which is kind of biometric facilitation of passengers through an airport, really bringing those two concepts together and saying, you can have a digital equivalent to a passport, but also append more information. So your boarding pass, and obviously the relevant one now is COVID passes. But where it was at the time was very much focused on just making life for passengers traveling through the airport a lot easier. It was always envisaged, and it's actually in the original concept paper, that there would be additional data points that would be added onto the identity. So it became a natural extension when COVID came around to start looking at kind of antibody tests, vaccine credentials as they're coming around now. And that's ultimately kind of evolved via a different path into the IATA Travel Pass initiative. So the underlying technology between KTDI and the IATA Travel Pass initiative is largely the same, especially the technology stack, which is built on Hyperledger Indy. But it's obviously been just undertaken by different organizations, and it's now being rolled out at scale. So it's obviously starting from different angles, but it's given that there's now very much an onus on kind of touchless experiences, but also very much moving into a digital realm and trying to make user experiences as simple as possible. That's kind of led to how many like health passes or COVID passes there are out there in the market.
There seems to be a lot of focus with these health passes on kind of the whole concept of interoperability, and I guess that was something that was taken into consideration when you helped co-author the KTDI specifications guide. I never really know how to feel about the whole concept of interoperability in this space quite yet. Just looking back in like the history of different networks and stuff that have popped up, the need for interoperability only really seems to come about once there's adoption of certain things, or there's dominant networks and there's business value to create interoperability between these. A lot of the focus in the digital identity communities seems to be around interoperability, and for good reason. It's kind of the ethos of why we're trying to have these portable, interoperable, verifiable credentials. But was the whole question of interoperability kind of at the core of the specifications that you helped co-author for the KTDI?
It was, and it's actually at the core of KTDI as well. So I can't speak too much for the program now that I've departed it. But one of the primary challenges that KTDI was solving for is a passport is used around the world. So there was never going to be a central hub of information. So if you were traveling between, say, the Netherlands and Canada or Australia, the chances of them all being subscribed to the same central hub is just highly unlikely. And there was a solid argument for actually you would never want that hub to exist. You'd never want a single database with every single passenger's information in that travels around the world. It's just the largest honeypot of data you could ever think of. So as a result, it was really a focus on like, how can you make this data portable in a way that it's trustable, kind of accepted anywhere. But I think the other part of it was looking at avoiding the typical problem that comes with identity hubs. And that kind of speaks to your kind of when should interoperability come in. And one of the reasons why there has been such a focus on it inside the kind of self-sovereign ID or decentralized ID space is that a lot of the kind of contingent in those spaces have come from more traditional identity kind of technologies. And if you implement a centralized hub model, one of the challenges is you need to select a vendor for it, and they suddenly become the holders of the key, so to speak. If you want identity data, you need to go to them. If you want to bring on a new use case, you need to go to them. And it's why potentially why we've seen governments around the world starting to lean towards self-sovereign identity, is that actually you no longer select a single vendor for the entire country to go and build out an identity hub. You can select as many SSI vendors and networks to provide the underlying infrastructure. And as long as they're still kind of meeting the right standards, all of this is interoperable. And I think it's been a great goal and a great kind of mission for everyone to go and work through that almost immediately. When I was back involved in financial services blockchain, it was something that was kicked down the road for a long, long time. And I think it's fantastic that the SSI space has gone, we know that this is going to be a problem extremely soon. and we're going to tackle it head on very, very early rather than wait for it to become a problem.
Good point. And I think that there's many different pushes towards this kind of model. Like, first of all, from a cybersecurity standpoint, having these central hubs has just proven time and time again to be a bad idea. From a regulatory standpoint, data privacy laws and now digital ID laws are coming through, and Europe is leading the charge on the new digital ID laws as well. And I guess just not having that vendor lock-in and not having all of the data just centralized in one source like a Facebook or whoever is owning this data, and having this portability gives the flexibility and control to consumers to kind of move stuff where they want. And we're also seeing, I think, a little bit of a shift now where there was a lot of stuff that was moving towards the cloud over the past 10 years. And enterprises are still deploying cloud strategies, although there's a lot of hybrid strategies being deployed. And I'm sure you have a perspective on that, having been with a large consulting firm like Accenture. But there's a big shift towards the edge too. And that's a lot of the stuff we're doing in self-sovereign identity is what can be stored on the edge for security reasons, for privacy reasons, for lowered friction, for lowered costs, for everything. And so we start moving towards this whole self-sovereign identity space. When did you really get acquainted with this, like all of these things, or self-sovereign identity?
So it was while I was at Accenture, and actually myself and our CTO Ankur Banerjee were looped into a proof of concept pilot with the National Health Service, or one of the trusts. And what they were looking at specifically, and I think this is kind of public knowledge now, which is why I'm able to speak about it, is they were looking at credentials for doctors specifically, so health professionals. So even though it was within the health context, they weren't looking at patients. They were very much focused on the professionals there. And the reason behind that is that inside the UK, when a doctor or other health professional moves between different hospitals, or certainly different trusts, which are to some degree groups of hospitals, they need to present their educational certificates and general professional qualifications each time they move. And if you're, say, a locum doctor, which is typically a doctor moving between trusts pretty regularly, almost like a contractor, you can be presenting those documents on a monthly, bi-monthly basis, like pretty frequently. And there's a company called True ID directly looking at this, but they, I think, estimated that roughly per year, there are somewhere around 50,000 doctor days a year that are just lost to presenting documents. And that was really the first kind of taste of SSI that I had, was seeing this, looking at just how ridiculous some of the identity process that we go through are, and how repetitive, and how actually they don't really agenda like higher levels of trust, because those documents are largely being checked over by someone who isn't necessarily qualified to do so. And that was really the first taste of kind of not just SSI, but also almost a consortium model of a lot of companies coming together to solve a problem, and break up the problem into individual pieces that could then be worked on collectively. And that was, I think, it was also the first demonstration I saw of SSI in terms of like a tangible mobile app that I could see. And I think that's, for me, that was probably the tipping point, because a lot of people, when you put the SSI experience into their hands and show them what it looks like, and I had a personal experience here as well with KTDI, as soon as you show anyone what the experience looks like, they're sold. They can't imagine a life without it. And I think that's partly why, or one of the reasons why I started Verum with Ankur, is that we've both had enough of these experiences where we know what the future could look like. And it's extremely frustrating to then go and use other applications which exist right now, which don't follow that paradigm. Like every time we put the KTDI mobile kind of demonstration in front of everyone, they were so impressed, and they just couldn't wait for the world to look like this. And that was the same for the NHS as well. And we're really looking forward to actually be able to make that a reality and make it so it's pervasive, and just the way that everyone goes about their daily lives without really needing to think about it anymore.
It's funny you say that. I had a conversation with Riley Hughes, the CEO of Trinsic, on a previous podcast episode, and kind of a couple of comments that he had made, which I think you'll echo them as well, as kind of once you get into SSI, you don't get out of it. Like anyone that gets into it, it's so similar to people who get into the crypto space. Like once you see what's possible and you really understand it and it clicks in your mind, you'll just never get out. And the second comment is, and then you start seeing applications of it everywhere in your daily life. Yep. You start doing stuff and you're like, oh my God, it would be so much better if we could do it this way. And so after that happened, and once you start going a little deeper into the whole space, trying to lead in now to the formation of Verum, what were some of the problem statements when you were looking at the whole SSI space that you felt like, we can maybe improve some things in this space to gain more adoption of this?
Sure. For us, it really boils down to one, well, maybe two. And I think for us, it's commercialization of the technology. The analogy that I've used a couple of times is it's like the early days of the internet, where a lot of incredible engineers came together and created something absolutely, like, obviously genius level. But it took a long time for kind of adoption to be achieved. And obviously adoption now happens quicker and quicker and quicker. But it took somewhere around a decade for kind of proper adoption to kind of come through. And it was largely as people started finding business models to build atop the internet and find new revenue models, new commercial models that they wanted to construct, which previously weren't possible before. And I think for us, that's been the missing piece for SSI is you've got this amazing paradigm. You have this completely transformational way of treating data. And really a lot of the technology is beginning to come together to go and support that, from like the networks where we're playing through to the application development. But really the bit that we feel is missing is the ability to commercialize the technology. And for us, one of the reasons why we want to go down the token route is that in SSI, it's highly likely that two organizations across each side of the world who eventually will interact with each other, or at least the data from one organization will flow to another via an individual, will not have any contracts in place. And as a result, they need to know how to pay each other, in what currency, at what kind of rate in between, but also the ability to kind of manage reputation and liability between those organizations without them ever necessarily speaking to each other. And I think the big, I guess, to kind of labor upon it, the big thing that we had seen missing so far was that commercial angle. And obviously we want to make it as easy as possible and allow ecosystems to stand themselves up as easy as possible. But we also want to make it so that the commercial model is almost solved before the project even moves to proof of concept. Because transparently, what myself and Anka saw happening repeatedly was that projects would get to proof of concept or pilot stage, and then they'd stall. Everyone would have that kind of, like you were saying, that moment where you get hold of it and you're like, this is amazing, I see it everywhere. But then someone in the room would go, but how do we make money from this? Like, how are we going to commercialize it? How are we going to drive revenues or reduce costs? And we want to make it so that question is almost answered from day one. And we can actually bootstrap the ecosystems and make them easy to stand up, because the commercial model is already solved for and extremely easy to stand up. And I'd say it somewhat solves the second problem that I was going to lead on to, which is just adoption. I think one of the challenges there is that there's obviously a really passionate community, a really passionate SSI community, and it's starting to broaden out. But it's not received kind of widespread awareness. Like if I speak to my family, they have no concept of what it is, despite the fact that it would completely transform their lives in a way that not many other technologies would, especially on a day-to-day basis. And so I think there's a second part, which is kind of making that awareness or kind of driving that awareness with the wider community. And I think that one of the items we may explore further down the line is kind of the token as a route to go and do that, and using that as a mechanism to go and engage the wider community, drive awareness of SSI, but also I'd say just drive awareness of SSI and break it out of the current kind of highly passionate kind of technical crowd that is currently around there, into kind of the person on the street who ordinarily wouldn't have come across the concept, but they certainly have come across Bitcoin, and it could provide another realm to driving adoption that way. So there's obviously the solving it via the commercial angle, but there's also the more marketing side and making this understandable to individuals and digestible by them as well.
Are there a lot of similarities with some experience that you have in the whole blockchain or DLT space too? Like if you say a lot of projects get stuck in pilot mode, you could probably make some similarities in kind of the DLT space where people are trying to form consortiums for name your use case for transparency, for immutability, for whatever. A lot of these lack a token, which in the crypto space or the permissionless blockchain space, the reason why these things have the value that they do is because of the communities that form around them. And the reason why the communities are able to build so large as they are is because there's an incentive mechanism in tokens. If you contribute, there's a possibility for you to get rewarded in a token. And so people kind of have this incentive. So I guess two-part question here is, one, do you see kind of similarities in where the, I guess the SSI space is versus just the other blockchain use cases? And then second of all, in with this token model, do you see it as being more adopted by ground up projects rather than enterprise? What's the perspective on this?
Oh, good question. So I guess on the first one, definite parallels. Probably the clearest one is that a lot of people have got very excited by an incredible new technology, which I completely agree with them on. I think the bit that gets missing sometimes, and certainly that I've seen missing across both kind of wider blockchain applications, but also SSI, is not crunching the numbers first. And I think that's maybe because SSI has been missing that kind of incentive or commercial model so far. But even in kind of wider blockchain applications, like the inability to go and do a feasibility study or do a kind of a business model to say, is this the right idea? Like, is this worth doing in the first place? And I think I saw lots of projects where there was a lot of excitement around the transformational kind of capabilities or potential, but no one had crunched the numbers first to check whether it was viable or not. And I think as people got further down the line, obviously, like I was saying, the demo comes out, everyone's like, this is incredible. And then you need to start putting together the business case to go and put it into, say, kind of roll it out to production. And at that point, a lot of projects suddenly found that actually it didn't add up. And kind of that proof of concept, whilst it was incredible, didn't quite have the return on investment that justified bringing it live. I guess to kind of take a slight tangent from there, like what I found really interesting when starting up Verum was, and it kind of leads onto the community side of things, was the sheer number of people who in a corporate world were focusing on kind of private blockchain applications, but in their personal lives were getting into fully public permissionless ways of interacting, ways of kind of creating content, selling it, all that kind of stuff. Like there was such a difference between their work lives and their private lives. And I think that's going to merge more and more and more. And that kind of brings me on to the answer to the second question. I think we kind of have two directions that we're taking. And throughout standing up Verum, we're very much focused on almost a hypothesis-based approach to doing things. And we've kind of got two going right now, and they're kind of independent, but may end up clashing at some point. And the first one is that the kind of crypto and DeFi spaces are probably the easiest for us to step into as a network. And the logic there is obviously that as a public permissionless network, it's a technology and a stack that others are kind of comfortable with, both from a technology and kind of development perspective, but also from a regulatory legal side of things. So kind of use cases that we're looking at are things like reusable KYC, which I believe Kilt are looking at as well, but also some others. And I think that provides a kind of real avenue for us, given that it's a technology stack that entire community is used to. And given that we're building on Cosmos, it's again another technology stack, a protocol that they are kind of attuned to and have used in other projects. So we see a really good avenue there. I think on the more enterprise side of things, we actually saw a bit of a switch whilst we were, or kind of over the last couple of years, whilst I was on KTTI and then kind of as I left, in that a lot of projects are beginning to look more seriously at public permissionless. And there are a couple of reasons why. I think the main one is that obviously private networks provide you with more control, but they significantly lose out on the network effects. And that's really where public permissionless comes into this own, is unexpected connections to other organizations that provide massive value. So as we move kind of into identity and the ability to, like, obviously there's been loads of interoperability work done on the DID side of things, so that DIDs can effectively reside anywhere. But as you start looking into decentralized autonomous organizations, as you look into payments and complex tokenomics, a lot of that is easier if you're kind of either on the same network or kind of adjacent. And that becomes very, very hard to do if you have hundreds of different private networks. And I think there's slowly a realization that actually moving towards the public permissionless space, whilst acknowledging that you need to account for things like the environmental impacts of proof of work and avoiding those, I think there's starting to be a big shift. I've somewhat seen that a couple of times where organizations that were originally looking at private networks were beginning to look at, say, public permissionless networks like Sovereign, and really considering those openly. And probably the primary example of that is, I think the British Columbia guys who built the verifiable organization network on Sovereign. They've been public permissionless from the start. And I believe probably part of that reason is that kind of openness, that transparency, and those connections that you can build with other organizations, rather than having multiple walled gardens where no one can really speak to each other or not speak to each other in an optimal way. So I guess to recap on that, there's very much a focus into kind of the Web3 DeFi crypto space, just because we're native to there. Certainly our technology stack is, and we know that there are some use cases that we can knock out there, and a lot of opportunity and value to drive out as well. But that's not to say we're not looking at traditional enterprise, because that's historically where myself and Anchor have come from a background perspective, and we kind of understand that space quite uniquely, we feel, given the breadth of experience that we have both across kind of SSI and identity and payments. But as a result, it's definitely one that we're focusing on and making sure that anything that we build is suitable for enterprises that are looking at public permissionless. And we really hope that longer term, that's everyone.
Yes, so many things to unpack from what you just said there, but it's fantastic. But I think a lot about adoption of self-sovereign identity. I think a lot about adoption of just general Web3 technology stacks as well. It's interesting in the identity space. There's kind of like, I look at it as three layers. You kind of have like this paper-based world that people are just trying to digitize stuff and just create digital experiences to reduce friction. You then have kind of this layer in between, like if I think about, if you compare it to another industry, it's kind of like the fintechs. It's if people are trying to start kind of digitally native experiences from the start to disrupt. But then on the whole other side, you have kind of this Web3 layer as well, where everything is digitally native to begin with. And I really like your quote earlier of just people in the enterprise are looking at these enterprise blockchain solutions, but in their personal life, they're quite curious about kind of these permissionless open environments. I think that is so true. And I do agree with you that more and more enterprises are starting to look at, kind of go through this phase, like, and having been in the crypto or blockchain space for some years now, you kind of see the ups and downs of people going towards public and permission or enterprise, however you want to label it. But there's some good evidence and some very reputable companies, just like EY, for example, that is all in on Ethereum. So it's just cool stuff to see there. And another point I just wanted to make too, from what you had said, is it's standing up consortium environments without a proper business model or incentive model is kind of a dangerous endeavor to get into. Within the TrustOverIP's Utility Foundry Working Group, which I am a co-chair of, and we actively participate, and I'll be asking you guys after if you guys want to join this working group with us. But we're drafting more and more best practices for assisting ecosystem solution providers to evaluate existing public identity utilities, and B, if there's none of them that kind of meet their criteria, how to start their own. And some of the key things to look at is the sustainability of it, which in a consortium, just standing up a consortium without a proper business model, you could question how sustainable it's going to be in the long run, how affordable it's going to be in the long run as well. And so clearly you guys have chosen Cosmos. Would you mind just talking about what led you to choosing Cosmos for Verum, and what excites you about the overall Cosmos ecosystem today?
Yeah, sure. And I guess just to go back to your TrustOverIP element, like we've got Alex Tweedale, who's joining us as governance and compliance lead, and really one of his areas is going to be focusing on like both working with TrustOverIP, but also contributing back some of the work that we're going to be doing, especially on the kind of governance via code or governance as code side of things. So really looking forward to kind of contributing back to that area. In terms of Cosmos, though, one of the, I guess, to provide a bit of the context of how we even started looking. So obviously, a lot of native projects, or a lot of existing identity projects, SSI projects, are using the Hyperledger Indy stack. Certainly one that I've been kind of closest to over the last 2-3 years. Really what started us looking was looking at our timelines. So looking at trying to get to market kind of certainly this year, ideally a lot sooner, as soon as possible. Really, we started to identify kind of the big blockers to bringing a public permissionless network live, but also doing it in a way that is kind of secure, very easy to use, but also has all of the surrounding services that you would need to both provide liquidity, so exchanges, decentralized exchanges, but also security, so things like custodians. And broadly, I guess then also tying that to kind of longer term ambition of what we want to do from a product roadmap perspective, and look into kind of complex tokenomics, the ability to have DAOs, the ability to do governance as code within that, and also the ability to then grow out across multiple ledgers. And I think it's probably worth spending just a minute there, is like we're aware that DIDs are kind of being grown out across everywhere. We've seen efforts on like Indy, Fabric, Corda, Ethereum, Ion, like they're going across ledgers. So longer term, there's absolutely an ambition that like we won't just be on Cosmos, like we will be kind of pervasive is the hope. But I guess when we looked at both immediate timelines and how quickly we could get this to market and the services that we would need to do so, but also the longer term visions, both of those were a lot easier on another network which had native token functionality. So that's the likes of Ethereum, that's the likes of Stellar, Polkadot, Cosmos. The reason for moving away from Ethereum was largely that kind of that carbon cost. And that kind of damage there, but also just the ability to kind of control our own currency, control our own token, and be able to kind of manage the tokenomics that way, rather than beholden to the swings of Ethereum. The example Anka gave in our recent webinar was when Elon Musk tweeted something about, I think it was Shiba coin, and gas fees just shot through the roof. And that's something that we really don't want to affect identity use cases. So that kind of took us away from the likes of Ethereum. What then focused us down actually onto Cosmos was, one, the native functionality there, but also kind of the emerging maturity of the ecosystem. So it has that kind of native token functionality. It has the governance as code or governance via code side of things. It has the ability to kind of build longer term DAOs, like complex tokenomics. But there's also a load of projects there that are already starting to do these things, open source projects that we can work with and contribute back to, where there's already kind of code base there to leverage, and even just relationships as well, and kind of seeing how other people have done it, even if we're not leveraging their code. And I think there's that kind of, that makes our roadmap easier, both from an immediate perspective in terms of kind of bringing the network live, but also longer term, just how much we can achieve and bring forwards. It's been interesting for us in that myself and Anchor have been through enough technical due diligence so far to know that typically you start with rose tinted spectacles, and things just get kind of harder and more challenges appear the longer you go on. Cosmos has been the exact opposite of that. Every single time we look at kind of what's available to us, it's making our lives easier and bringing our roadmap forward. So that's been a big thing. But I kind of touched on the other point already, but spend a bit more time on it. One of the biggest things for us was the availability of exchanges and custodians. So one of our big items, if we had continued down the indie path, was that we would have to go and convince custodians and exchanges to go and adopt a new protocol in indie, and actually a protocol which only would have had, at the time that we built it, one token implementation. In contrast, working with organizations who already support the Cosmos ecosystem, we're simply asking them to support kind of a differentiated kind of network. So it makes kind of that side of things infinitely easier, because transparently, those guys are very, very busy. The custodians of the exchanges are flat out. So expecting them to build for a dedicated protocol is a massive expectation and probably not appropriate. Whereas kind of working with them to implement kind of just uplifting kind of their basic Cosmos support into something else is a much easier ask. So those are the two drivers behind it. It's like it's making our life from a product development perspective infinitely easier, and hopefully we'll get some more details from Anchor in a blog over the next week or so. But also from just a partnership perspective, it was so much easier to go into Cosmos than it was to stay on Indie. And I guess the final thing to say is that why not the likes of Polkadot, and why not the likes of, say, Stellar? I think Stellar, as far as we could tell, suffered from the same problem as Ethereum, and that we may need to kind of purchase a lot of Ethereum just to be able to issue our own native token. So that was obviously for us not a good use of investor funds. But to kind of compare against Polkadot, which we are asked about frequently, given obviously kind of Kilt stepping into the space, is that for us we just found more useful existing projects and community there that could help us get through this quicker. So we see Cosmos as a great ecosystem and a great network, but for us to do this at pace, we found that actually there's a lot more available to us on the Cosmos network, or the Cosmos community ecosystem, than that we could make use of and contribute back to, and that certainly suited us. So that's kind of the reason why not Indie, then the reason why Cosmos, and somewhat the reason why we chose Cosmos over all of the others.
It's quite interesting. If you look at a place like Silicon Valley and people start looking into why there's so many successful startups and unicorns that come out of there, and there's something to be said of that. There's such a dense community of startups there already that if you're a new startup, getting your first 10 customers very quickly there is going to be easier than anywhere else, because you have the people there, you have the network there, so you're able to get that feedback loop a lot quicker and figure out your product market fit a lot quicker. I guess the same could be said with these kind of Web3 communities, or however we want to call it, where you have a vibrant community around something like Cosmos or Polkadot or Ethereum, or name your protocol, where you have people that are ready to use this stuff, and you have people that, number one, are savvy enough to understand this and really see the value with what they're already doing. And so it makes adoption a little easier there. And so You mentioned
I completely agree.
So you mentioned some of the first use cases around kind of DeFi. What are some of the things that excite you there around combining SSI and crypto or DeFi? This is, again, an area that I think about a lot and am excited about, again. When you look at different protocols and you look at, on one side, we could talk about governments and banks and organizations and back to my earlier point, it's kind of converting this paper-based world to a digital world. There's billions of IDs and billions of things that could be done there. But on the other side, completely on the Web3 side, you look at certain protocols and just take Ethereum as an example and look at kind of the daily active users on MetaMask. It's nowhere near the amount of IDs that you would get in the paper-based world, but you have like over 5 million daily active users that are using this and are very savvy in this and could benefit very quickly from some enhancements on the protocols. And so what are some of the exciting use cases, knowing that you guys are really looking at, I guess, the bottom-up community approach, looking at DeFi, looking at crypto? Why is combining SSI and DeFi so interesting to you?
Sure, and I think some of it comes down to just pure usability. I think for DeFi to reach its maximum, it needs to be as easy to use. And there's obviously debates on whether this is any of the people in these communities would agree with me, but as usable as fiat. And by that, I mean usable for my mum, someone who just has no ability to go in, manage her keys, make sure she's copying the right kind of wallet address, making sure that it's going to the right places. She could certainly do it, but it would take far too much effort for her to ever have an interest. And I think that's where ultimately kind of the identity side of things can come in and make things easier. So I'll come on to KYC in a bit, but I think one of the areas that we could look at is adding a kind of peer-to-peer identity layer for just peer-to-peer payments. So when we've been kind of transacting historically, myself and Anchor, whenever we're moving money around, there is always a first test payment, or there's a Zoom call to make sure that the right person is holding onto the wallet at each end and that the money moves, basically. And it's just not something that you would ever have to do in fiat world, because you can, like, through things like confirmation of payee in the UK, you can actually check who is at the other end of a bank account without having to exchange a huge amount of information. And as a result, for us, like one of the areas is like, what could you provide alongside a wallet address that gives some assurance, gives some comfort that you are in fact like in control of that wallet. And that could be anything from a passport, like just a picture and a name that has come from a passport that's been checked in by, say, an organization like Onfido, Jumio, Trulio. So gone through one of those kind of more traditional ID and V vendors. Or longer term, it could even be something as simple as a Telegram handle. So showing that you have an attested, provable Telegram handle from Telegram, and that it is being attached to a wallet address. I think that immediately makes it infinitely easier to start kind of being able to pay friends through this, being able to transfer value between people without needing to do test payments, all that kind of stuff. So I think building in that identity layer whilst making sure that it is entirely private, so it's only between those two individuals, I think will just make this so much easier for the average user. Like the ability to kind of pick up your phone, pick up Telegram, or pick up anything and just be able to drop money over to kind of, whether that is kind of anonymously, so they're hiding behind a moniker, or they're actually a known individual, just being able to almost drag and drop money is where this needs to get to. And then I guess we get into kind of more structural areas. So I guess probably it's something that you've seen, but I still find it slightly insane that that KYC is repeated across the centralized exchanges rather than kind of wrapped into the wallet functionality. It slightly baffles me that I think a lot of the exchanges that we've signed up for are using the same provider. So I've actually been KYC'd by the same company 3 or 4 times, and they've just sold my results on to different organizations each time. I think that's something that's kind of accepted in fiat world because it's, I guess, less digitally native and happens at maybe a little less frequently. But for those who are kind of in that Web3 community and DeFi communities, like, I find it slightly insane that it's okay and acceptable and hasn't been thought through that we really could be using those credentials repeatedly and driving down the cost as a result and making this much more efficient. And I think that then kind of transitions into, like, I guess, collateralized loans and all that kind of stuff, like where you're looking into kind of financing pools, all that kind of stuff, where actually you may want to know some of the identity, or you may want to be able to do KYC without ever knowing an individual's actual identity attributes. So the ability for, say, a debt pool or a financing pool to be completely KYC'd, but without actually storing anyone's personal information. And I think you can then, like, have a level of assurance and also potentially meeting kind of country regulations, and really bring it much more towards that point where it can be widely adopted. Like, I think that's where, like, the latest example in the UK was that Binance was obviously didn't get an FCA license and now can't operate within the UK, even if individuals in the UK can kind of use their exchange services from outside. But I think the more that, like, KYC and the identity of individuals is such a cornerstone for regulation, that to make it widely adopted in the way that I was describing with my mum, it kind of needs that layer in. Otherwise, it's always going to fall at that hurdle. So I think there's a breadth of this. There's identity just to make it more usable, and then flowing through everything from reusable KYC, which I think absolutely needs to exist, and then more into, like, looking into more structural finance elements where actually you can start meeting regulations and do so in a really privacy preserving manner, so that those individuals who want to stay anonymous can do so while still providing kind of collateral that meets regulations and meets those processes. So I think there's a complete range of how it fits into the DeFi and crypto space.
At the end of the day, there's a lot of opportunities for risk reduction in that space, and there's a lot of opportunities to collect different proofs from different reliable sources and look at KYC maybe a little different. That in the government regulated banking world, you need to provide a couple of reliable sources of government issued IDs and so forth. But like you kind of mentioned, in the crypto space, and potentially when you're dealing with decentralized exchanges, or potentially when you're dealing with DAOs, having a proof of a social account, having a proof of funds, or a kind of decentralized credit score or reputation or something like that, it is something that is quite valuable for what the people are trying to do using this certain DeFi protocol or whatever they're trying to use. And then it ties it back once again to we're seeing, I guess, with these reusable, verifiable credentials, there's a lot of opportunities for issuing organizations, or I call them trust providers. You mentioned kind of Onfido being one of them, that will OCR a driver's license, and they'll provide data based on a bunch of integrations they've done about someone's identity or someone's transactions for AML purposes or so forth. But there's a lot of opportunities for issuers to issue a credential and through the reuse of these credentials, make reoccurring revenue. So a lot of these companies today on Fido, who I don't know intimately well, but understanding the space that they play in and knowing some companies in that space very well, a lot of them are on the transactional business models today, where they're selling you buckets of transactions, right? They'll charge you a certain amount per OCR or per check for a driver's license or passport, for example. There seems to be a big opportunity for these types of companies to move more towards a SaaS or a reoccurring revenue model through credential reuse. And that's where to make that happen, that's where you're kind of you're missing the tokenomics element to it, which you guys are attacking. I would be interested in just hearing some more about how you are structuring the whole tokenomics behind Verum. So understanding that you have a token that's being built on top of the Cosmos protocol, but if you could just go a little deeper, I would be very interested to understand a little more of just the whole tokenomics behind Verum, because I could see that really as benefiting some folks that are looking to create new revenue opportunities as trust providers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess just one thing you mentioned in the likes of the transaction models for the likes of Onfidos, the trust providers as you described them. I think over the last couple of years, I've really seen like a race to the bottom in that industry. Like it is so busy. It is now very much being commoditized. And there's been huge amounts of money being thrown into it recently, but it's also the time where from the consulting side, I saw the actual price per check dropping so quickly. And I think that's where actually moving into the SSI world means that you can do that check once or kind of infrequently to make sure that there's still high levels of assurance, but you can still then charge out at a rate that makes you a profit. And I think that's probably a model that we'll see in the future as the margins get compressed, as it shrinks down even further. It's like SSI is a natural home where you can do that check once and then kind of use the data repeatedly. But to answer your question on the tokenomic side, the analogy we've been using a lot recently is trade rules. And the reason we think that's kind of applicable is that in SSI, like I was saying at the top of the call, any individual needs to interact with any organization. So there needs to be this pervasive ability to both kind of send data, but also transact in kind of some form of payment in the background. So there needs to be almost an international trade rules version, but for SSI and the value flow. And that's really what we see as the function of the token, is the ability to allow kind of any organization in the world to interact with any individual and vice versa, and make it so that say a bank in Canada doesn't need to have an agreement with another bank or a telco or anything else in the UK if you happen to move between the countries, because it's simply just infeasible to have this kind of spider's web of or just entanglement of legal agreements and commercial agreements to make SSI viable. Like it really needs a pervasive layer. But we also, to kind of go back to that trade analogy again, we also need kind of the ability to have bilateral, unilateral, multilateral trade rules. And that's really where over the longer term, we're looking at like enabling the creation of new or dedicated tokenomics, and almost what we're calling tokenomic plugins. And the idea here is that like identity is commercialized in so many different ways. To go back to the examples we mentioned at the top of the call, like KTDI, I expect, I don't know, will likely monetize or charge for identity in a very different way to, say, the UK National Health Service and the project that they've undertaken. And they, in fact, will probably charge for it a different way to IATA's Travel Pass, again, back in the travel space. So we really need to be able to facilitate these rich, complex, flexible commercial structures that can kind of retain that flexibility rather than forcing everyone onto the same rails. So I guess to use the analogy again, like on the international trade front, where anyone needs to interact with anyone else, it's likely that we're aiming for a transactional model where you can just pay per credential, because it would allow an individual to travel from one side of the world to the other and still use their data and have the value flow occur. But we also want to make it so that each ecosystem can stand itself up, configure its own tokenomics and configure its own commercial model in a way that suits itself, and really incentivizes its own ecosystem. I think that kind of goes back to when I was talking about the governance as code. Tying those two together is how we want to make it as easy as possible for organizations or ecosystems to stand themselves up. We don't think that it should be on each ecosystem to create its own tokenomics and establish its own governance from scratch. we want to make it so that you have the governance plugins available, you have tokenomics plugins available, and you just need to configure them in the way that suits your organization or your group of organizations. And really, that's the aim, is make this as easy as possible to stand up and work together, rather than everyone kind of doing their own work in silo. Like it's much better to do this collectively, and I guess just make the ecosystems a lot easier to stand up, because for us, whilst we want to be that network that underpins SSI, really the reason we're doing it is we want SSI to be successful. We want to give people back their data and give people back their privacy. So it really all comes down to, like, how can we make the technology as easy to adopt as possible? And this for us is how we plan on achieving it.
All right, Fraser, I really appreciate you doing this, and I'm looking forward to doing this again with you in a few months, as things are going to be quickly evolving for you guys.
No, thanks for the time. Really appreciate it, and would love to be back.
Thanks for tuning in today. Hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. To stay up to speed with future episodes, or to catch up on ones you may have missed, make sure to check out the SSI Orbit podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and make sure you subscribe. If you have any questions, comments, or wish to see someone in particular on a future episode, you can find me by searching Mathieu Glaude on LinkedIn or Twitter. Feel free to reach out to me directly and I'll get back to you. See you all next time.